Well, very nice to have you here. Thank you very much for stopping by. Well, we are in our sixth encounter in the ReDICo 2024 Encounters series. And last week we had a very nice session with Adam Brandt and Alexandra Giucapoulou Nunes. And we also had an on-site session at the University of Jena here in Germany. And we'd like to share the link to the news that we wrote in relation to the on-site session last week. We are going to share the link in the chat. I think Jenny just did. Thank you, Jenny. And well, so this is the structure for today's encounter. My colleague Luisa Conti will moderate the session. And then we're going to have the first talk by Çiğdem, and then the second talk by Danielle. And at first, there will be a quick discussion between the speakers. And after that, we'll open the floor for questions and comments by the audience. And so as you know already, we are recording this session, but be aware that we are just recording the talks and the discussion between the speakers, so we won't be recording the Q&A with the audience. A question, please, a request actually, keep your microphones muted, unless you're speaking, of course. And I think that's it. So, and if you need technical support, you can contact any of us with a ReDICo background here. All right, so then we are going to start, but before we start, I'd like to introduce the moderator for the day, Luisa Conti. She is my colleague at ReDICo, and she is based at the University of Jena. And Luisa is interested in factors and mechanisms that foster and hinder the healthy development of communities, be them work teams, schools, or society in general. She's therefore interested in topics around diversity and the impact of digitalization. Luisa has a PhD in intercultural communication and education from the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, and she has held several leadership positions in various national and international research projects. So Luisa, thank you very much for moderating today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leni, for the nice presentation. Hello to everybody. So today I'm introducing you to very interesting guests who are experts of topics which combine very well together. So the first one is Çiğdem Bozdağ. Çiğdem got her bachelor degree in political science and international relations in Istanbul, and a master's degree in media culture in Bremen, where she also did her PhD in communication and media studies. So you notice already an interdisciplinary profile. She has been a postdoctoral research fellow in the Mercator EPC Fellowship Program in Istanbul Policy Center of the Sabancı University. And then she worked as an assistant professor and head of the new media department at the Kadir Has University. Today, she is an assistant professor at the Research Center for Media and Journalism Studies at the University of Groningen and a Marie Curie Fellow in the Faculty of Education at the University of Bremen. Leading her project included, which focuses on digital media literacy education for disadvantaged groups, in particular disadvantaged migrant groups. Çiğdem research interests include digital media use, media and migration, digital media literacy, media education in schools, and digital inclusion. Okay, so thank you very much, Çiğdem, for your presentation. You feel free to share your presentation so that we can,
yes,
all of us.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be part of this really inspiring series, also engaging us or inviting us to engage in dialogues. I think this is very nice and innovative in that sense. And today I will be speaking about the project that Louise already mentioned, which recently actually came to an end. So this was a Marie Curie project focusing on, so I'm someone who has been working a lot on migration and media especially. And with this background, I was interested in doing a research on digital inequalities, and then not only focusing on particular migrant communities, but looking at a completely diverse community. And this community is a school community. I was looking at young people in a school context who had very diverse backgrounds. And also looking at digital inequalities, I was also interested in questions related to socioeconomic background and socioeconomic inequalities, and looking at this whole picture from an intersectional perspective. And I would like to open up what I mean by this in this presentation as well. So looking at the overlapping influences of ethnicity, culture, age, gender, and also socioeconomic background, for example, on people's engagements with digital environments and with the digital society, and with a particular focus on young people. And these young people are located in Bremen, which is a quite big city in a rather developed, in a country that is developed as a very developed, well-established country with high numbers of internet users, for example. So they might not necessarily be in the center of attention when we are talking about digital inequalities. And I would like to show you how they are also, although they are young people, although they live in a Western country, how they are also very much disadvantaged through the influences of multiple factors. To give you the outline of the presentation will be, firstly I will talk a little bit about digital inequalities research and my approach to digital inequalities research, adopting a qualitative methodology and also an intersectional approach. And then I will talk about the methods of the study and come to the findings, where I will discuss, on the one hand, what I call patterns of socio-digital disadvantages, and on the other hand, the tactics, strategies of resilience by young people, resilience and resistance by young people to deal with these disadvantages that they are facing. So maybe some of you are already familiar with this body of literature. There has been a quite long history of research on what was more referred to as digital divide, especially in the 1990s, beginning of 2000s. But this concept of digital divide is now maybe less used because it proposes a binary understanding. So there is a divide, and there are those who are on the better side of the divide, and there are those who are on the losing side of the divide. So there are now more and more approaches which are rather nuanced, let's say, looking at the gradations of digital inclusion or digital inequalities. So digital inequalities is now also a broadly used term for referring to what was previously defined as digital divide. Still here referring to the terminology used by Van Dersen and Helsper, who were talking about 3 levels of digital divide. So this is also very much in line with the development of digital inequalities research. The first level of digital divide research started already as the internet and personal computers started to be used by more and more people. And here the focus was very much on the issues related to access, inequalities of access, who is online, who is not online, who has access to digital devices and who doesn't. As the access rates started to increase, and also as research was advancing, people quickly realized that it is not always only about the inequalities here, are not only about access, but also partly about differences in the skills people have in digital environments, the digital skills, digital literacy, and also the engagements. So they might have the skills, but they might not engage in with digital technologies in a beneficial way, for example. And then more recent literature also looks at what is called the 3rd level digital divide, referring to more the outcomes of digital media engagement. So who is benefiting from the digital environments the most? And especially here, but also in the first two levels, we see a strong correlation between socioeconomic and sociocultural inequalities and the digital divide. So people who are, for example, economically disadvantaged in the society are also the ones who are less benefiting from internet technologies. There is also some research showing correlations between low skills and socioeconomic and sociocultural disadvantages, for example. Also, migrant communities, for example, although there is no linear argument here in several studies, they are also often disadvantaged in terms of lower skills, lower access rates, and lower benefits from digital technologies. We can also say, looking at the body of literature on digital divide, the studies are still predominantly standardized and of quantitative nature, which is, of course, good for seeing an overview of who is, in a sense, disadvantaged in the digital society. But at the same time, I think we need studies that can show the complexities of digital inequalities, because there is often not a linear relationship between people's backgrounds and their involvement in digital environments. They might be disadvantaged in relation to particular factors, but they might really be very resilient and competent in others. So I think what we need is more and more studies which adopt a more qualitative and grounded approach, looking at what is happening in specific contexts among different groups of people, instead of only adopting standardized and top-down defined research methods. So instead of this, looking at how, as Alper and colleagues are suggesting, looking at how young people, or also the other groups of people in the society, actively negotiate media technologies in their everyday lives, and how they are dealing with these technologies, how they are adopting these technologies. And also moving away from the deficit-oriented approaches, which might further traumatize people who are marginalized in the society. Constantly focusing on the deficits, instead also focusing on, for example, assets and competences that people have, and trying to strengthen these. One access point here is, I think, our social practices for studying digital inequalities from a qualitative perspective. So I am here suggesting a practice-oriented approach to understand how people engage here with digital technologies and how they are influenced by, for example, social structures in their practices. And furthermore, besides the qualitative approach, I think it's also important to adopt an intersectional approach here. We know through, for example, feminist research and feminist literature, and also critical race theory, that inequalities do not emerge based on singular factors, based on the influences of singular factors, but different categories, different demographic factors like gender, socioeconomic background, race, ethnicity, age, abilities might have an overlapping influence on people's positionalities in the society and put them in rather oppressed and marginalized positions. And also in relation to technology, like Koen Leurs and Sandra Ponzanasi suggest, we can look at the interdependencies between categories, which influence then, on the other hand, how people are adopting technologies, affordances, how they are making use of these technologies, under the influence of these different overlapping categories, and not seeing this then in a rather static and essentialist way, but in a constant reconfiguration. So it is also important to keep this in mind, also coming from more social constructivist backgrounds, not thinking of these categories as something pre-given, but rather as something that is constantly reconfigured and re-articulated in social practices of the people. And I think an intersectional perspective for studying digital inequalities can be beneficial in many regards. Firstly, it could help us to avoid linear and essentialist arguments about marginalization and privilege, so we don't end up presenting certain people as in a continuous vulnerable position, but look at specific context and see how privilege or disadvantage might be articulated in particular social practices or influence certain social practices. Intersectionalism can also help us going beyond what Miria Georgi in a recent keynote talk addressed as migrant particularism versus digital universalism. What she meant by this is, as people who are working on migration, we partly tend to also overestimate the role of migration that plays that migration plays in people's lives and focus too much on factors related to migration. Of course, migration has an influence. Having a migration history in the family or having an own migration history has an influence on the way people engage with the world, engage with media. But it's not the only thing. So there are multiple factors influencing a person's identity, social and cultural context. And I think intersectional perspective can help us to deal with this as well, looking at people's contexts in a multi-layered perspective. Başak Bilecan also refers to this as ethnicity bias in migration research, for example. I think an intersectional perspective can help us indeed to try to go beyond this. And also, through the intersectional perspective, looking at the multiple oppressions that people are facing, we can also, in a sense, reunite social practices with structural categories, looking at how these structural categories are articulated in the social practices of people in an overlapping manner. With this kind of proposal to study digital inequalities from an intersectional and qualitative perspective, I designed this study, which was shortly called Included, focusing on how digital technologies can be used for social inclusion of people who are maybe in marginalized positions. And this study was designed as a participatory action research, but combining elements of media ethnography, because I was involved in this school in a culturally very diverse and socioeconomically rather disadvantaged neighborhood of Bremen for a quite long time, in a period of over a year, also including partly a period before and after the pandemic or during the pandemic. So this also had an impact on my involvement in this school and also on my research design. I won't go into the details of it, but partly I could do offline observations and focus groups, and then online observations, and then I could go back to the school, do some more focus groups and observations. So it was really on and off over a period of 15 months, around 15 months. But this was also interesting because pandemic brought out a lot of interesting questions in relation to digital inequalities as well. And I will partly talk about this when I'm discussing the findings. And I also did interviews with teachers and a lot of observations, and also informal discussions with the students there. And the idea here was also to develop learning scenarios together with the teachers and students to critically question the media environments that the young people are engaging with, and also empowering them through developing their skills and critical thinking in relation to digital media. And again, this is not going to be part of what I'm talking about today, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. So based on these all these materials that came together after this study, I started thinking about how to implement the intersectional analysis also in the analysis period and for presenting the findings. And I think one thing that's important here, as Winker and Degele, who kind of define intersectionality also as a methodological approach, they call for a comparison based on intersectionality, but a comparison that does not predetermine dimensions of comparison beforehand. But so the idea here is not necessarily looking for references to ethnicity, migration background, gender, and then compare these from the beginning onwards, but rather to look at, based on the research question, rather to look at the patterns that emerge and then to look for example, gendered and ethnicized practices within these patterns that can be observed within these patterns. So I try to adapt this also in the research question that I had, and I came up with this concept of patterns of socio-digital disadvantages. The reason I speak of disadvantages and not exclusion is that I think disadvantage in a sense implies that the people are not necessarily responsible for these disadvantages. So it is not about low skills, for example. It's not an individualized issue, but they are put into a disadvantaged position by the society that they live in. And it's not again binary understanding that is as it is implied in digital inclusion and exclusion, for example. So I think that's a concept that enables a more nuanced understanding of how disadvantages work in digital society. And I speak of socio-digital disadvantages because I think these disadvantages that young people face are not only related to digital environments, but they are very much influenced and shaped by social environments as well. And then I could identify, and I would like to develop this concept further. I should also maybe mention I'm still working on these ideas. And what I'm presenting here is, in that sense, a working paper. So happy to receive feedback from you, but also bear with me when it's not very clear cut yet. So I'm still thinking about all these concepts, but I think this concept can help us to study digital inequalities in particular context. So this could also be applied to other groups of people, for example, women with migration background who also have lower socioeconomic status and so on and so forth. So I think we can study different communities using these concepts and approaches. With this said, I would like to then come to the patterns that I could identify looking at this context of young people in a culturally diverse and rather socioeconomically disadvantaged context. There were especially 5 patterns that were shared widely among the participants of the study. So it means that not everybody, not all the participants faced maybe all these disadvantages, but these were really crystallized in the interviews and repeated by several participants. And some were experiencing overlapping disadvantages. So the first thing here is, and after presenting this, I will rather focus on because I presented this also elsewhere, I want to rather focus on the tactics of resilience in the face of these disadvantages. So I will briefly talk about this, but not show examples for this, but rather the resilience practices. So limited material access refers to really having bad quality access to digital technologies. This is not something that you would expect. Again, looking at, for example, the prices of devices, the availability of mobile phones, and so on. But actually, material access or accessing digital technologies is not only about having one device, but also about the quality of, for example, the connection, quality, speed, data limitations, screen size, and also the diversity of available devices. So having a diversity of devices could help you to differentiate between the devices when you are doing different tasks, for example. If you are only limited to using small screen mobile phones for all the tasks that you are doing, your actions in digital environments are also going to be limited. And this was indeed the case for many of the young people who were participating in this study. Only a few had a shared computer at home. So computer access was a serious issue. This meant that they were learning through their mobile phones. They were learning also, this is also part of the quality of access rooms that you have available for example, using digital technologies. If you are living in a small apartment, sharing it with multiple siblings, family members, your quality of access is also decreasing. Or if you are trying to write an internship application, for example, from your mobile phone screen, this is a serious limitation. So this is related to really having limited material access. And also, for example, when your phone is broken, not being able to replace it, maintenance of technologies, repairing things, all this plays into this idea of material access. So it's not just about being online, but also about the quality of access you have. And the young people that I spoke with were, in that sense, in a quite disadvantaged position. The second point relates to digital irritation. I borrowed this term from Itre Arne and Mu, who were looking at people who were complaining about, for example, surveillance in digital environments, very much irritated by what's happening in terms of data collection and exploitation of data in digital environments, but still they continued to use it. This was very much the case also among the young people that I spoke with. They were really complaining about not knowing where their data goes, not knowing, for example, if their phone is listening to them. This was a point of constant worry. But at the same time, and we also discussed this as we were doing the learning scenarios, even then, really becoming aware of the processes of datafication and data surveillance, they continued using these devices. One thing that puts, I think this is the case for many people in the society, not just for these young people, what is more maybe extreme for them is that the digital mobile phones were really at the center of all their leisure activities because of lack of other opportunities, for example, of participating in multiple courses and so on. This wasn't the case for many of them, and they were really using their mobile phones for entertainment, for socializing. So they were overexposed to screens in that sense, and maybe overexposed to exploitation by social media companies, for example, because they are producing more data than their peers might, in a sense. The third point relates to lack of support structure. So when I asked them where they get support when they experience a problem in digital environments, the parents were not mentioned at all. This is a quite contrast to other studies on young people with middle class or upper class background, for example, where parents are very much involved and put restrictions and also offer guidance to young people. Not only parents were, partly here parents were overworking. There were a lot of single parents, for example, among the parents of the interviewed young people, or maybe some of them were lacking digital skills, for example. This was also mentioned by some. And also the school did not offer support in terms of digital competences and development of digital literacy, for example. This was very much absent from the school context. I think this is still a serious problem, especially in schools, looking at schools in Germany. So support structures were lacking. They were mainly relying on peer support, for example, or also really self-learning through the internet. So that this was also their strategy for dealing with this lack of support structures. The fourth point that I would like to raise is related to partly missing and partly unrecognized socio-digital skills. So missing skills, I think the digital skills of young people are often really overestimated. So we assume they are born into digital technologies because they can also use social media and various apps very efficiently. They can also use digital media for their own benefit. But this wasn't necessarily the case, especially also this lack of access to computers and so on leads to also lack of experience in a sense. And people actually mostly learn through experiencing technologies, experimenting with technologies. And this was really leading to missing digital skills in some senses. And also one thing to mention is related to unrecognized skills. I think this is also creating a disadvantage if particular groups are always perceived as lacking skills, or when their skills are not recognized by social institutions or by authorities, in this case, for example, teachers. One example here could be multilingualism, for example. Multilingual use of digital media is actually a really complex skill, if you think about it, navigating between different media systems, between different social contexts. For example, having multicultural or culturally diverse WhatsApp groups, and being able to navigate through different languages and different signs and different cultures here. This is a really important skill, and this is not only unrecognized by the school, by also peers, but also partly criticized. I will show you an example for this later on. And it's not the only thing. Also, for example, digital skills that are seen as leisure-oriented skills are also very much underestimated by the teachers, for example. But we know by research that kids also learn about digital media by playing around, by experimenting, by also doing entertaining things that can be a way of building digital skills. And this is very much ignored by the teachers as leisure-oriented activities, which do not really contribute to the children's empowerment or digital literacy. The last pattern of socio-digital disadvantage that was very commonly mentioned in the discussions was really the experiences of discrimination, online and offline. So they were really dealing with this and also discussing this among themselves. So what is discrimination? They were mostly referring to discrimination in relation to their ethnic background or cultural background, partly skin color, for example, but they were also kind of transferring this idea of discrimination to, for example, gender discrimination, against homosexuals, for example. This was a big discussion in one of the focus groups. So there was a lot of discussion about discrimination because they were also experiencing and witnessing discrimination in their everyday lives. And this is also related to socio-digital disadvantages, because partly it was preventing them or making them more reluctant to share anything on social media. We also know from other researchers that, for example, people in marginalized positions face discrimination more often in online spaces. So this was also something that I could see because of they were afraid of hateful comments, for example. They were rather avoiding posting on social media or producing content for social media, for example. So looking at these disadvantages, I don't want to argue that these young people were in a continuous vulnerable situation. They did their best. So this is actually, all these patterns of socio-digital disadvantages emerged through also social structures, socio-cultural inequalities that we are facing in the society. But they were also building strategies for resilience and also for resisting these disadvantages that they were experiencing. Before I give you some examples of how they were doing it, what do I mean then by resilience and resistance? Firstly, I think resilience has become a really buzzword, a very, very popular concept in the recent years. And in the most basic terms, it is defined as the ability to adapt to the face of adversity, so adapting to crisis situations, difficulties. I think there is an overemphasis on the individual here. So this could be problematic, and I think Koen Leurs wrote a really good article on this, criticizing this approach and how it is actually leading to the over-individualization of the problems and to a deficit-oriented approach. And he is calling for a rather critical understanding of resilience, which then also acknowledges the societal disadvantages that people are facing. And I think this is also very much in line with what I would like to present here. So these practices of resilience, and not being resilient doesn't mean that you are weak or you are lacking something, but it might really be indeed related to these structural factors that you are facing. Resilience is then the ability to deal with these inequalities, but they are not only dealing with these inequalities, but partly also resisting these. And I mean this not in a way to mention collective protests or so, but rather in the sense of everyday resistance, more subtle and micro scale practices for questioning and also challenging and partly avoiding the disadvantages that they are facing. And there is also not always a clear-cut distinction between, I think, practices of resilience and resistance. Partly being resilience goes through resisting the structural barriers that you are facing, and kind of trying to avoid harm that comes through it. And we also see that resilience and resistance is practiced through and also about media communication. So partly also about the disadvantages that come through digital media. I will then focus on two of the patterns of digital disadvantages that I talked about, giving you examples of how they are dealing with this in their everyday life, how young people are dealing with this. So talking about the first disadvantage that they are facing, not having good quality access, I will talk about the iPad project that was implemented in Bremen. So many of the young people, as the pandemic started and as they were asked to participate in online teaching, online learning, for example, they were really relying on their small-scale mobile phones. And the state of Bremen, I think it was in the summer of 2020, they decided to develop a project and invest in iPads and distribute iPads to all school children in the state of Bremen, so that they could participate in online education. And this continued after the pandemic. So this is an ongoing project in Bremen, and teachers are also learning to use iPads, for example, for education. I don't have examples for that here, but talking to the young people, I could really see that this was a very timely and effective intervention, because they were really lacking structure in their everyday lives. And through the iPads, the school could implement an online school day structure, and the young people really benefited from this, having continuous contact with their peers online and also with the teachers. So setting that aside, I would like to show you here one example of how they were actually questioning and, in a sense, resisting this idea of the usability and functionality of the iPads in the discussions that we had, because they didn't have a computer at home. One of the young girls that I was talking to was mentioning that, okay, yes, this is very nice that we have the iPads, but for this money that was paid for the iPads, we could have gotten something better, because actually something with a keyboard, like a laptop, for example, could have been much more functional. So she is actually, on the one hand, of course, adapting to this new developments and using the iPad, but at the same time, really not expecting this kind of top-down decision that was made, in a sense, which comes with certain limitations, again, in terms of material access. So this could be seen as a form of really subtle resisting to the ideas that were developed by the authorities, by the institutions. And there were others who were rather building resilience around this and trying to make the most out of this. This is an example for another girl who was saying that to, in a sense, overcome this limitation of not having a keyboard, she purchased a pen, an affordable pen for the iPad and also an app for 10 euros. And then she wanted to make the most out of the iPad. So this is actually a strategy that many of the young people had, also sharing devices with their peers, with their siblings, for example. So although they had limited material access, they were really trying to make the most out of what they have in their hands for multiple purposes, for entertainment, for producing content, for learning purposes, for example. And this is I think, a way of building resilience despite the limitations that they are facing. And here you can see that she is also really questioning why she cannot keep the iPad after that, because she really wants to make the most out of it. And she also invested in it, in a sense, to be able to benefit from it. And then I would like to show you very briefly two other examples which kind of link to unrecognized socio-digital skills. One thing that came out that was mentioned by multiple interviewees, and I actually talked about this in the last year's ReDICo conference in more detail, was something related to language learning and reaching out to further cultures, faraway cultures. Many of the participants were actually very much interested in Korean music and Korean series, and also Japanese series were mentioned, for example, here. And this, in a sense, was a way of engaging with other parts of the world, other languages and other cultures in an environment where you have very limited sources for actual physical mobility, or, for example, for traveling, for participating in courses. So in this sense, they were using digital media for engaging with other cultures in a rather cost-effective way and learning about them. So this is actually also something that can be seen as a practice of resilience in the context of socioeconomic limitations, and also a sign of a cosmopolitan orientation in that sense. The last example that I would like to show is in relation to resisting language hierarchy. So this can also be seen as a form of everyday resistance. I already mentioned that multilingual use of digital media is a skill that can be really recognized in the school context and appreciated in the school context. But on the contrary, also in peer discussions, we see, for example, a problematization of use of native languages, especially when these languages are more stigmatized languages like Arabic and Turkish, for example. And here there is like a discussion in the focus groups among the young people. And maybe I won't be able to explain it in very much detail, but this was about using Turkish in one of the subgroups that the girls were in. And actually, they were really saying that they are really careful about languages. So if there is someone around who doesn't speak Turkish, they don't speak Turkish. And only if there are only Turkish-speaking people around, then they switch to Turkish. So this is a really careful consideration of the social context. And I think this is quite respectful. But then they were still criticized by another peer, Alex, all are pseudonyms, of course, here, he was accusing them of speaking to each other in their own language. So he was, in a sense, really othering the girls and problematizing their use of Turkish. And I think what Dilan says is really nice here. In a very subtle way, she's normalizing multilingualism, because this school is a very, very diverse and very, very multilingual school. And she says, so everyone speaks in a different language, including the person who is criticizing them. So in very subtle ways, I think the young people are also resisting these hierarchies and these stigmatizations around their native languages, for example, and also in relation to digital media environments. So this was the last example that I wanted to show you. With this, I am coming to a conclusion of the presentation. So my idea here was really developing a more grounded and intersectional approach to studying inequalities. And here the studying point is the social practices, which not only allows us to look at digital disadvantages, socio-digital disadvantages, but also at the same time looking at practices of resilience and everyday resistance. I hope that I could show you how this is functioning in the everyday context through the examples. And I think important is still addressing how socioeconomic and sociocultural inequalities here are also contributing to different forms of disadvantages in the digital society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Çiğdem. Thank you very, very, very much. That was very interesting. So yes, you showed very well what you want to show. In particular, I thank you for the concept of patterns of social digital disadvantage. And I think it's very useful to understand also the complexity of digital inequalities, and also to highlight the center of our topic today, of our talk today on intersectionality. Yeah, so how intersectionality as a concept, as a perspective, is so important to get rid of essentialism and simplistic views on phenomena which are much more complex. So you brought us on one side on the structural issues, but also to see, and you showed us also with your example, real social practices, so how they display. So thank you very much. And now we give the word. Now we give the word to Daniel, or Daniel. Daniel Silva is a professor of applied linguistics at Universidade Estadual de Campinas, called Unicamp. He has a degree in languages from the Brazilian State University of Ceará, and a master's and a PhD in linguistics from Unicamp. Daniel did a postdoctorate at the Linguistic Anthropology Center of the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. And he has been an associate editor of the Journal of the International Association of Pragmatics, and is currently co-editor of Trabalhos em Linguística Aplicada. So he works in the field of applied linguistics. Daniel investigates on literacy, language contact, and linguistic ideologies, and has been organized in international collaboration projects on the relationship between violence and language. His current research articulates, his work also problematizes the mediatization of violence. So again, here we are focusing today on media, and he looks at the case of Brazil, but not just Brazil. And he looks at alternative communicable models in places of resistance. So thank you very much, Daniel. Your stage is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, for welcoming me here, and thanks also Mileni and all the ReDICo team for this wonderful series, and also to Çiğdem for being here, my conversational partner today. I will present a slide. Can you see it? Very good. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about the emergence of intersectional perspectives on race, gender, and sexuality in an educational experience affected by insecuritization. And it was so great that Çiğdem did a very good introduction, critical introduction to intersectionality. So I will just walk a few steps from what she said. So in fields like international security studies and sociolinguistics, securitization refers to the production of security through a logic of exception, especially in critical sociolinguistics and the work of like Ben Rampton, who was in the ReDICo workshop, and Jena Charalambos. They also use this in prefix because security to one group may be insecurity to another, as we see in this picture. So securitization is the name given to a set of discursive and institutional processes where existential threats to the state are identified and groups are moved out from ordinary politics into exceptional measures where normal political rights and procedures are suspended. This is a definition by Jena Charalambos and colleagues in a recent book that I refer you to. So favelas are neighborhoods built by their own residents, and most of these residents are Blacks. These are spaces of intense securitization in Rio and also elsewhere in Brazil. And the logic of exceptionality that has shaped government security strategies mainly targets young Black men living in favelas who are reduced in conservative discourses to the stigma of being potential members of drug factions or the mundo do crime, the world of crime. Through fieldwork, I have been in dialogue with activists from Complexo do Alemão. You see on the picture on the left, an area, like an aerial view of the community. It's called Complexo because it's a complex, like a group of favelas. And it's interesting, the name, because Alemão in Portuguese means German. And this group of favelas was named after a Polish immigrant to the region who owned a farm, and then it was squatted and turned into a community, like a favela. And the man was called German because he was Alemão, because he was white. So it's some piece of intercultural semiotics here. So through various collective actions, these activists resist Rio's securitization. They also build networks of solidarity and action to challenge anti-Black racism and bypass the reduced access of favela residents to education, to public health, to leisure and income. You know, we also see these advantages at play in this community, some sort of parallel to what Çiğdem just brought. And an illustration of such collective initiatives by these local activists is the educational experience that I will present today. So a local NGO called Raízes em Movimento, or Roots in Movement, organized the third edition of Favela Doc, which is a documentary production workshop for young residents of the neighborhood. So in 2021, students took classes in documentary production, techniques, and social political training. They also produced a script and filmed a documentary about the elderly in the favela in Complexo do Alemão. So due to COVID-19, you see that people are wearing masks there. Most of the training took place with these health measures and precautions. So a lot of the classes were through Google Meet. I did not live in Rio at the time, so it was I took the advantage of being able to follow the training classes on Google Meet. So I will describe here an educational experience, more specifically a class where a young Black social scientist born in a favela and the students who were mostly Black residents of Complexo do Alemão, they together unlearn legacies of patriarchy, colonialism, and racism in Brazil. So here I initially used the verb to unlearn. To unlearn ordinarily as disengaging from usual knowledge, or as the Cambridge Dictionary defines it, as making an effort to forget your usual way of doing something so that you can learn a new and sometimes better way. Yet I will above all engage with theories and practices of unlearning that may be found in the work of scholars from the Global South. In their work, unlearning figures as a critique of the iteration of colonial ways of knowing. So I'll present 4 perspectives on learning from the Global South, and the first is Paulo Freire, who, all you know, was a Brazilian philosopher, and his educational experience with peasants in Chile and Brazil became influential worldwide. And he offers an important starting point. In his well-known Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire delineates the oppressive structures of learning rooted in the educational model that he called banking education. For Freire, banking education, which is centered on an ideology of language where knowledge is seen as being instrumentally deposited in the head of the student, as we do in a bank. We deposit money there. And for him, this is also alienation. For Freire, the oppressed become alienated by introjecting or hosting themselves the structures of oppression. Following his very detailed description of alienating practices in education, Freire proposes disalienação, or the overcoming of alienation, as a specific practice of unlearning. It's interesting that this word was not translated as disalienation into English, but Freire used disalienação. And for him, this term is very polysemic, but the meanings include an education that leads the oppressed to reject a banking education in favor of a dialogical education, and also to unlearn to be beings for others who introject the alienation and become beings from themselves, beings who are aware of their condition. While the second approach, Frantz Fanon, was contemporary of Freire and also influenced the Brazilian thinker. For both, dehumanization or alienation is affected through the introjection of domination by the oppressed. So Fanon was a psychiatrist, and he emphasized the psychic dynamics of this intrusion of the oppression. Racism in a colonial context depends on what he calls deculturation, that is the destruction of cultural values, ways of life, language, dress, techniques, everything gets devalued. Among applied and sociolinguists, it's very well known, the argument by Fanon, that for a Black person in a colonial situation, to speak proper French is to speak like a white person. Like Freire, Fanon was used the vocabulary of alienation to explain how colonized subjects introject inferiority. Plus, as a medical doctor, he was committed to healing this introjection. And the process of healing is also a process of unlearning. So for Fanon, to unlearn racial inferiority first implies recognizing that a previous learning process has been consolidated in a process that has 2 layers, primarily economic, and subsequently the internalization, or better, the epidermalization, he was a medical doctor, right, of this inferiority. Recognizing the economic and psychic operation of racism may open up ways to expand forms of life that had been reduced by domination. In the conclusion of his famous Black Skin, White Masks, he says, I quote, "I'm not a prisoner of history. I should not seek there for the meaning of my destiny. I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence," end quote. In other words, unlearning the oppression that one has historically introjected also implies making room for inventing and creating new conditions of existence. Writing more than 6 decades after Freire and Fanon, Musna Ayawed Bishara engages centrally with the process of deculturation or denationalization of the Palestinian youth. she explains that an important counterpart to the military domination and surveillance of Palestinians is what she has called with colleagues colonized education, a term that captures how Israel has, and I quote her, designed Arab education to denationalize and particularly to de-Palestinize Arab students. In her ethnography, Bishara documents how a broader surveillance policy is carried out in the education of Arab minorities in Israel. In an ethnographic study of the teaching of English as a foreign language in a Palestinian Arab high school in Israel, she describes in detail how a teacher iterates the depoliticization of education. For instance, the teacher avoids using Arabic terms related to the Palestinian struggle and instead translates them into English as a means of detaching them from the politics that affects the students. Yet Bishara is also interested in documenting how the Palestinian youth undo this stifling of their voice. She has recently published a very interesting and insightful piece that you see on the screen on the sumud pedagogy, which is a word for steadfastness, resilience, not in individual terms as Çiğdem brought, but as a collective resilience. Bishara examines how the Palestinian youth engage with the pedagogy of sumud, and I quote, as a particular revolutionary and liberating Palestinian mode of being that encodes a liberational potential for humanity, following Paulo Freire. Bishara examines how young Palestinians, through different discursive strategies, challenge colonial fear and refuse to be silent about politics. So the pedagogy of sumud is at once a practice of learning, so they learn to speak up, and also unlearning, for example, to feel the fear, which had been learned before. In her words, challenging the politics of silencing entails learning how to become liberated Palestinians through unlearning colonial practices of de-Palestinization. Rodrigo Borba is another contemporary author who theorizes on learning. In his ethnography of the transsexualizing process in Brazil, Borba observes that the production of true transsexuals, that is, subjects seen as adequate for the treatment by the health system, this is a trajectory of unlearning. He observes that users in the clinic, and I quote, gradually unlearn their particular ways of understanding their gender identification and adopt signs that make them coincide with the medical regime of the true transsexual. The true transsexual is an essentialist semiotic model where the medical system reduces an immense range of desires, practices, and experiences to a biomedical model that, quote, pathologizes transsexuality as a mental disorder. Borba's work suggests that unlearning certain signs is not inherently critical, emancipatory, or liberating. His ethnography draws attention to the importance of analyzing unlearning in context. For example, for some of his interlocutors who were seeking gender assignment surgery and hormonal therapy, unlearning previous practices, for example, having pleasure with their birth genitalia, meant silencing this pleasure at the appointment with the doctor. In other words, knowing that aversion to the genitalia of birth is a behavior expected by the biomedical model, some users would lie in their health appointment in order to pass as true transsexuals and get approval for the surgery. Here, unlearning was a contextual tactic of survival. Borba's work is particularly useful for situating unlearning not as inherently emancipatory, but as contextual, strategic, and variable. A situated and empirical perspective such as ethnography is therefore important to avoid romanticizing unlearning in a particular social group. Okay, now let's go to the data. The Favela Doc class that I bring for analysis was entitled Gender, Segregation, and Culture. And just a parenthesis, the names that are shown here were approved by their holders, and other participants are not identified or identified with nicknames. So this class that I bring for analysis was entitled Gênero, Segregação e Cultura. It was taught by Joyce Lima, a Black woman, a social scientist, and an activist from Raízes em Movimento. Joyce sought to place the discussion of gender, sexuality, and race in the context of the Brazilian periphery. So in the beginning of the class, she explains that she wants to, and I quote, start from where we are, from peripheral and favela bodies. As I pointed out in the beginning, favelas and peripheries are spaces that disproportionately suffer the effects of Brazilian insecuritization. So this class took place on May 13 in 2021, as I said before, just 7 days after Rio police left 29 people dead in a raid on the Jacarezinho favela. I showed you international articles. At the time, the body count was 25, but in the end, it was 29. You can search this on Wikipedia, for example. So it was part of Operation Acceptis, reference to exceptional, and pretty much goes in line with insecuritization. The police raid was allegedly aimed at cracking down the recruitment of children by the drug traffic, but we later knew that this was just an excuse. Yet a police officer was killed just in the beginning of the raid, and then the police killed 28 people in the favela. This was one of the most violent operations in the history of Rio, and Joyce, a week later, draws on this tragic event to position her discussion of gender within the context of militarization. That's how she terms insecuritization, that their lives are militarized, different from wealthy areas where you don't see the same police, harsh police. So in her words, this recent event, the Jacaré massacre, right? It's essential that we start discussing gender from a context of militarization. We have commonly discussed gender in academia using European concepts, right? I think that this is the case for anyone who has had access to these readings in academia or has heard some of the talks. We quickly identify that many concepts are not part of the peripheral reality. The students had various educational backgrounds. Their ages ranged from 18 to 40 plus. The younger ones were either high school teachers, undergraduates, or graduates from high school. Some were older participants, with some with little schooling, but also others with high degree of schooling, but they were all somehow literate in community activism. So Joyce first recognizes this heterogeneity, but regardless of the access to education, she poses the challenge to everyone to unlearn, or to unlearn to discuss gender using European concepts, as she said in the quote, since many of these concepts do not apply to their reality. A local concept that differs from the European reality is precisely the fact that racialized and gendered bodies in favelas are those subjected to Brazil's violent anti-Black racism. Further, in a very interesting intersectional move, she speaks of masculine and masculinized bodies and feminine and femininized bodies. So the first term refers not only to people socially perceived as males, but also those whose bodies are socially read as masculine. So in her initial description, she says, male or masculinized bodies are the bodies that are the easiest for the bullet. They're the bodies that can be immediately killed, right? An example of this male and masculinized body that suffers violence happened in 2014 in Congonha Hill. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's near Madureira. Cláudia Ferreira was murdered on her way to buy bread. She had a masculinized body and was mistaken for a drug dealer. I bring Cláudia mainly as an example. She was a woman, right? A female person, but masculinized in the eyes of the state. And she became the target of violence and was murdered because of it. By saying, correct me if I'm wrong, Joyce suggests that the knowledge about the death of Cláudia, a person whose body was masculinized, was shared by the group. Cláudia Ferreira's murder became notorious in Rio. On her way to the bakery in the morning to buy bread, she was mistaken for a drug dealer and shot by the police. The police then placed her in the car and she was dragged out of the car with the car in movement and she died. And the police claimed in their defense, and I quote, that the coffee cup that she was carrying had been mistaken for a gun, end quote. The officers placed Cláudia in the police vehicle, but her body fell out of the car and was dragged for around 300 meters. Residents filmed the act and the images were quickly recirculated in the news media. Cláudia was often referred to by the newspapers, not by her name, but as the mulher arrastada, or the dragged woman, a sensationalist appellation that erased her name and inflicted additional symbolic violence on the victim. I have a screen capture of a news article. This uses the dragged woman, but then they place her identity, etc., somehow responding to the sensationalist way that the media had been portraying the case. So Joyce adds a further dimension to Cláudia's murder, the fact that her Black body was read by the police as masculinized. Black masculine bodies, as she explains, are the easiest for the bullet. We saw it in the transcript. And the people killed in the Jacaré massacre, for example, were mostly men. So before describing the feminine and feminized bodies, she suggests a specific exercise. She shows the class this image, and she asks this question. We're seeing people demonstrating, obviously, that they're protesting inside the favela. The majority of people protesting in the favela are apparently of what gender? And Manu, a male participant, says women. This was a protest following the massacre. So image and talk interact interestingly here. Joyce is showing the students a familiar image, which is an image of protest, but she also defamiliarizes them by showing the image and showing that women are at the front line of protests and care. She connects this perception with a more detailed explanation of the role of the feminine and feminized bodies in the front line of care. She then asks the questions: who's going to fight for this man who was arrested, for this man who was killed? Who's on the front line in the fight for justice for these bodies? Have you ever thought about who organizes movements, who's going to make the visit in prison, who will bring the food, who runs after the public defender, which gender is predisposed? So these questions lead the class to unlearn previous knowledge about gender, and she draws attention to the fact that women in a militarized context are the ones who organize care. She, however, does not fail to show that women and feminized and feminine bodies also suffer violence. So she says that at the same time that we have this masculinized body that is the target of violence, the feminized body suffers other forms of violence. For example, it's a body subject to abuse. For example, in the middle class sensationalist media and discourse, they're talked about as, quote, factories of criminals. And also in the favela, they suffer other forms of abuse. Just a final set of data, I'll be fast. It's also important to look at to how unlearning emerges on the part of the students, and comments made by the students during the class are an evident uptake of her input on gender and sexuality. And in interactional studies, uptakes of previous utterances are crucial because they may demonstrate how textual units are, and quote, aga, incorporated into widely routinized practices that rely on and replay them, or by conversion into artifacts of more durable kind. And I suggest viewing Joyce's input also as substrate, and I use Goodwin's definition of substrate as whatever utterance or other public source that is being used as the point of departure for the operations used to build a subsequent action. So in this interaction, or in interaction, actors are constantly drawing on previous units, and they will may be used in future units as well in an open-ended process. So, so the students draw on resonances between their lived experiences and what Joyce brings. So it's interesting that sometimes we hear expressions such as agora eu percebi, now I realized, which index an emerging perception. So for example, Manu, who responded that question before, who worked in the emergency committee in the favela during the pandemic, he says, well, now I realize that the majority of the people who were going to be interviewed by the social workers were women. And the person who was going to assist them was also a woman, right? For Manu, the leading role of women on front line of care during the COVID emergency was not self-evident. He realizes it through interacting with Joyce. And based on the inferences from the class, he then outlines a gendered landscape that identifies those seeking food for their own homes and serving on the crisis committee as women. I'll just briefly show the other data. Ricardo, another participant, also pretty much says that something is emerging. So he says, I'd like to say that your talk challenges the traditional view of gender. Most of the time we think of gender as feminine, right? But you expand it. Perhaps it would be worth looking for some kind of research that may be talking, for example, about the amount of suicide and abandonment of homes by men because of the relationship between the killable body and alcoholism that you described. What are the causes of this? I think there is a lot of social pressure on men to keep working, and I experience it. So you see that Ricardo is also coming with an emerging perception. And just the last excerpt, participants also took Joyce's input, so to speak, to be able to express what they learned in the past and how they're changing this habit. So for example, Katya says, well, I was that child that bullied, so I think I've made a lot of people feel bad one day in my life until I discovered that my sexual choice was something bad for society, for the world. At home, people said it was the devil in my body, and that's when I began to realize how much I had hurt people and how much people had hurt me by judging me as a demon because I liked women. So it's very interesting, this like unlearning of bullying and lesbophobia. Okay, just to conclude, we have analyzed an educational project of unlearning led by favela activists in Brazil. And I tried to maintain a dialogue between unlearning in a documentary making workshop and Global South authors who theorize unlearning. So we saw dialogical education in Paulo Freire, the creative leap in Fanon, the pedagogy of Sumud by Bishara, and the educational tactics that enable transsexuals to tackle the unlearning that is imposed by the health system. And it's important to have in mind that the anti-racist educational agenda of these collectives and of the global periphery is a normative project with defined goals that align with collective projects that have emerged in a number of peripheries across the globe. So we basically see a class that is part of this normative project. And as we saw, there's this whole entanglement of gender, sexuality, and insecurity. And the class also proved to be a favorite space for students to openly talk about their lives and to talk about their unlearning of symbolically violent practices such as bullying. So building on the collective construction of perspectives against bullying, Manu, who was a young participant, suggested thinking of an alternative education which offers alternatives to the reproduction of hate. I would say that the class at hand is an instance of this alternative education. Favela Doc led to the creation of a participation framework where semiotic resources, embodied dispositions, and ideological perspectives were calibrated to build more livable and expansive conditions for the Black youth. I suggest that to think together with Manu and the other young activists about this normative project could be extended beyond this community, and we could see how it resonates in other contexts and how it could change along the way. Thank you, and sorry for being so long.
Thank you, Daniel. No, you haven't been so long. It has been really, really great. I thank you in particular for the great selection of authors you brought, but also that you really brought us closer to everyday oppression. It is a very valuable experience. I mean, the chance that you gave us to come closer and see realities which we wouldn't see or we wouldn't know otherwise. So I would start with a question that I ask both of you, so that you can get in dialogue with each other. And then we leave a bit of space and time for questions and comments of the other people participating to this encounter. So, Çiğdem, you spoke about patterns of social digital disadvantage that are mainly, but not only, characterized by restriction of the freedom of experience in the digital realm. Indeed, you have shown how resilience is practiced in form of everyday resistance in many different ways in everyday life. Daniel, you also refer to the vulnerability of some members of society. In particular, you refer to the Brazilian case. You focused on the opportunities that digitalization offers for emancipation from internalized oppression and oppressive narratives. You also refer to the notion of unlearning, saying that it is potentially emancipatory because it describes the process of re-encountering reality, looking at it from a new perspective and interpreting it through new codes. So not colonialist codes anymore, or gender codes and so on. So we could argue that on the one hand, the intersectional matrix of oppression is reproduced in the digital part of the life world. Let's think of Çiğdem patterns. On the other hand, both of you have shown how digitalization represents a chance for the liberation of marginalized people from oppression. So finally, we could say that Paulo Freire's vision that you also presented, Daniel, could become everyday practice. So with your context in mind, my question is, what is needed to exploit this potential of the digital for promoting social justice more effectively?
Who should start? Should I? Okay, I will just start and then give the word to Danielle. I think firstly, one thing maybe we also need to raise is that the inequalities that we face in this world are also partly related to the neoliberal system that we are living in. And of course, we need to talk about the symbolic aspects and also how we are internalizing, normalizing this economic system as well. But I think we also need to be aware that this system is creating and increasing inequality. So we also need to raise questions related to this. This economic system is not sustainable in the sense that it is going to create more and more inequalities that puts people in marginalized and disadvantaged positions. And we are also, like many other aspects that we discussed today, normalizing these inequalities in our everyday life. It is important, I think, Danielle's talk was so inspiring to think about all these processes of dialogic learning and also unlearning what we have internalized, what we have normalized, what we have learned and what we don't see as well. Maybe also revealing our own privileges in a self-reflection, and also trying to understand the life worlds of other people and the difficulties that they might be facing. Really listening, I think, is also, if a dialogic learning process is going to take place, it is going to take place if we only listen to each other and understand each other's perspectives as well. Yeah, I think this is important also for social justice, for becoming aware of the structures that create privilege and marginalization in the society, and unlearn and undo it in a sense, try to undo it in a sense, and also raising the structural issues that keep reproducing certain inequalities. I want to also close this, or maybe later on I will also ask a question to Danielle. But maybe I will just give the floor to Danielle.
Thank you, Çiğdem. Yes, my response goes on the same direction. Indeed, neoliberalism, just this word for the contemporary capitalism, just took over, and the marginalized communities we study are pretty much affected by them. And I think that here today we saw some ways to maybe, find a, a detour to this patterns of segregation. I really, really liked looking to Çiğdem's data, because I think they show, they point to alternatives. For example, that example of the student who purchased a pen to make the best use of the iPad, and the fact that the iPad could not be kept. Also, that the iPad was possibly not the best device. And that really, I think that's an example of how, engaging empirically with and spending time with communities who are disadvantaged may show like really interesting avenues for example, for policy making, and how, for example, people who have more access to policy, I would say that academics are, in a position where they could try to reach out. That's a very interesting way to go there. And in my case, I didn't draw a lot on digital technologies, but I tried to point that that was, for example, an interaction that took place on digital media, and we see in the past I did an analysis of that with Mileni, and we see that, for example, in the another class that we studied before, that some participants, for example, didn't have a laptop. It would be interesting to, you know, do some sort of survey to understand whether that was just on the occasion or whether they were not able to do that. But it's also interesting how in my data, for example, in the other classes, this sort of like invention, this collective resilience, so to speak, is applied by the participants. And I would say that like technologies are not magical. I think Çiğdem pointed very interestingly to this point of, you know, for example, minority youths may be exposed too much to the digital devices and, for example, work for the capitalist system, to the platforms providing data more so than others. So I think the point is to something that's very interesting on the grassroots level is how communities can also build ways, you know, to use technologies to their advantage, knowing that we have a neoliberal system that is basically trying to adapt and make advantage of this.
Thank you to both. Çiğdem, you said you have a question for Daniel.
Yes, I was thinking, because this concept of unlearning is so interesting, and Daniel, what you presented today focuses more on the internalized aspects and unlearning the internalized hierarchies, power relations on the side of the oppressed rather. But do you think that this concept could be a useful concept for those who are rather in privileged positions, who are maybe also the oppressors in the society? Do you think we can also apply it to that?
Yes, for Paulo Freire, this, you know, overcoming of oppression would also work for the oppressor. And it's very interesting that he points that the oppressed are in a better position to bring this awareness because they, you know from experience this dynamics of oppression. The point is that we see so many ideologies circulating in societies, and you know, I'm reading about, for example, the far right emerging in re-emerging in Germany, for example. So I think it's we may need an intersectional, so to speak, bibliography to handle with, you know, how this overcoming of oppression could be possible in a world where, you know, these ideologies are just taking over, and, you know, digitalization plays a big part in that. So I think it's I believe that Freire's critical model is very interesting, but I think we also need a lot of ethnography and a lot of, you know, interactional engagement with these groups, and also, for example, with oppressors, so to speak, you know, like these followers of these, you know, very problematic, so to speak, ideologies, to find ways, you know, to handle this in a way that is not predefined by the theory, but in ways that, you know, just heuristically we could handle that. I'll just give a very, very brief example. I have a colleague here in Brazil who studies these, for example, right-wing groups. And it's very interesting that she tries to understand their, so to speak, ecology and their worldview, and how that relates to how that's afforded by digital technologies, and maybe the best way to sort of unlearning, to promote unlearning is not to bring this, liberal view of, how we should be, like open to diversity, but maybe to try to find ways within technology and within their understandings of the world to find to a point where things are not as oppressive.